that eliminate all aspects that deal with non-tariff barriers. When you also look at, allow me to also dive into Article 75 of the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community. Basically, it provides that member states shall come up with a protocol, and that protocol is the protocol for the establishment of the East African Community Customs Union, whereby it's supposed to provide for elements, among others, include the elimination of non-tariff barriers. Before I go into that, it is also very paramount to note that the objectives of my research are, one is that the major objective of my study was to find out or to look at, to examine or analyze the legal framework on the elimination of non-tariff barriers. And then the other objective was to find out what enforcement mechanisms are being used to ensure the elimination of non-tariff barriers, and definitely to come out also with suggestions that can deal with the elimination of non-tariff barriers. So when I looked into those objectives, definitely my questions were that what is the legal framework on the elimination of non-tariff barriers? And definitely the other one was, what are the enforcement mechanisms that are being used by the East African community, to eliminate non-tariff barriers? So when you look at those two questions that instigated my research, is that, of course, there are various laws that have been established at the East African community to deal with the aspect of non-tariff barriers. There are various, among them include the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community, and I refer you to Article 74, Article 75 of the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community. I also refer you to the East African Community Customs Management Act, that also provides for the elimination of non-tariff barriers. I also refer you to the protocol in the establishment of the East African Community Customs Union, and also many other laws. Among them also includes the major principal legislation on that in the East African Community is the East African Community Elimination of Non-Tariff Barriers 2017. You see, the East African Community has so many legislations that basically provide for the elimination of non-tariff barriers. But however much there are so many legislations, they are comprehensive in nature, there is not so much that has been done in as far as eliminating non-tariff barriers are concerned. Though the East African community generally has done something, but still there is a lot that needs to be done. And one of the major causes of this is the weak enforcement. One of the major causes is the gap that exists within the legal framework. When you look at the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community, it provides for the different organs of the East African community. When you look at Article 9 of the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community, it provides for the various organs of the East African community. One of them includes the Summit, the Council of Ministers, the coordination committees, the sector committees, the East African Court of Justice, among others. The legal framework is very comprehensive, but there is a gap within that legal framework. The gap is that it does not give mandate to any of the organs of the East African community to have powers to enforce the East African community customs laws. So, and in specific, in as far as this is concerned, in as far as the East African community is concerned, when you look, I was talking about that the legal framework is comprehensive, but specifically on the aspect of the enforcement of the East African community laws, and particularly in respect to the non-tariff barriers, there is no law that gives mandate to any organ of the East African community to be incapacitated to enforce the customs laws within the member states. So that is one of the key factors. So my key finding, my methodology in respect to this study is that one, my research was qualitative in nature because it went into in-depth on the aspect of enforcement mechanisms and the legal framework that deals with the non-tariff barriers. Then the other aspect is that The other aspect is that the other aspect is that my research was also doctrinal in nature, because it looked at the legal framework that provides aspects to do with the elimination of non-tariff barriers. And of course, my research was desktop. It was not empirical in nature, and therefore I did not do any kind of interviews. However, my research was also ethically sound, because I ensured that I acknowledge all resources that were necessary in as far as my study is concerned. Definitely, when I was also analyzing my research, and I was also doing my data analysis, I used content analysis. I also used doctrinal analysis to come up with the findings that I came up with. Of course, with the key findings of my study in respect to my research objectives is that the East African community legal frameworks have a gap when it comes to the issue of giving powers to the East African community, or when it comes to the issue of giving powers to any organ of the member states to be able to enforce laws. So we do not have an organ that enforces laws. We do not have an organ that have the authority as per all the legislations that provide for customs laws, or that provide for elimination of non-tariff barriers for any of those organs to enforce law. So we have a loophole in respect to the law when it comes to the enforcement of the laws on when it comes to East African community laws. That is one of the major findings. The other important aspect in respect to my finding is that these non-tariff barriers obstruct the progress of the economic development among the member states, and therefore the agenda that is meant to be attained is not adequately being attained, because these non-tariff barriers are still persistent. And then the other aspect about still my study is that there are also challenges that are faced by the East African community when it comes to the issue of enforcing customs laws, and specifically on an aspect to do with non-tariff barriers. One of them is that there are institutional overlaps. There are also delays. There are also aspects to do with lack of coordination among member states. There is also an issue to do with the private sector state engagement is minimal in as far as the status quo now is concerned. The other aspect is about there is a high rate of digital illiteracy, much as we also have laws that can be able to eliminate issues of non-tariff barriers. Not so much has been done, because people are not well indicted or educated on aspects to do with digital and when it comes to elimination of non-tariff barriers. However, when you look at the enforcement mechanisms, as one of my second objective is that we are looking at the enforcement mechanisms that are being used by the East African community to ensure that they deal with the aspect of non-tariff barriers. Some of those mechanisms include that we have institutions. Though I said that we have a gap when it comes to the law on enforcement, or when it comes to the law on enforcement, especially on issues to do with the elimination of non-tariff barriers, it is also ironical to note that the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community provides for different functions of the different organs of the East African community. One critique that I would want to mention here is that the functions of most of them, the functions of some of those organs is legislative in nature. For example, for the summit, it is legislative in nature, and also the East African Assembly. When you also look at the Council of Ministers, its function is policy-oriented, and when you look at others, their functions are basically in coordinating perspective and also monitoring perspective. So that is how it basically deals with the issue of ensuring that there is compliance there is compliance on an issue to do away with the non-tariff barriers. Of course, there are also other forums that have been created. One of them is that there are digital platforms that are being created, although they are not maximally being used, because members, customs officers, and even the other stakeholders like clearing agents are not indicted well to know how to use them. As of now, the last time I checked, which is just minutes after I've come to present it, when on the digital platform that is shared by the East African community, East African community shared by COMESA and SADC, there are 910 registered complaints to do with non-tariff barriers. And however much that majority of them has been resolved, still you can see that there is a high rate of non-tariff barriers, and which the East African community member states need to deal with. Of course, apart from that, there are also other windows that have been created to ensure the elimination of non-tariff barrier, like the one-stop border post, the regional electronic cargo tracking system, the single customs territory. That we also have the non-tariff barrier mobile app, although it is not adequately also being used by the member states and even those that are those other people that are also in charge. So those are some of the mechanisms that East African community member states are using. And of course, you are all aware that when it comes to the issues of enforcement, the national revenue authorities of different member states also play a key role to ensure the elimination of non-tariff barrier. But however, the most important aspect that I want to put or advocate for is that there is that gap where member states sometimes take advantage and create embargoes and create tariffs and create restrictions that cause the non-tariff barriers and then disrupt trade. And of course, they disrupt trade liberalization, which is one of the key factors that is established in the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community. And when, in terms of the policy reforms that I would suggest, in as far as my research is concerned, is that I suggest that there should be inclusivity, especially on issues when it comes to the private sector. I'm also advocating that much as there is harmonization of the standards and policies that are being used by member states, there should also be continuous harmonization, because as it stands now, most of the partner states have different tax regimes, and sometimes which brings in issues to sometimes which disrupt trade in that manner. And there is also an issue when it comes to that I advocate for is definitely I advocate for an amendment of either the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community to provide powers to the Council of Ministers to be incapacitated to enforce the customs laws, and specifically to enforce laws that deal with elimination of non-tariff barriers. Definitely, I will also advocate that there is development of digital infrastructure, because some of the member states are not up to date, or they are not on the same status with others because of it. And definitely, there is also a loophole when it comes to awareness. Most people are not aware of some of these even reforms that are being made, which makes it also impractical to deal away with non-tariff barriers. And then the other aspect that I also want to highlight is about, apart from those that have cited of empowering the East African Community Council of Ministers to be able to have authority as per the law, and also the harmonization, and also private sector engagement, especially inclusion, and also continuous sensitization of the member states. I will conclude by advocating that one of the key selling unique points that I would want everyone to pick in my presentation is that there is a gap in the law that when it comes to issues of non-tariff barriers, when it comes to issues of enforcement of customs laws, and that gap is basically in terms of the loophole that exists, whereby we do not have a regional organ that has the authority to ensure that enforcement of customs laws, especially on issues of non-tariff barriers, is being dealt with.